Friends, in this episode of our popular awareness series on pluralism and syncretism in India, we'll deal with another major charge, another major stereotype against the Muslims, against Islam, that Muslim kings spread Islam on the strength of the sword. There is a popular saying that Muslim kings came on the horsebacks with sword in one hand and Quran in the other. Now, this is totally fallacious. The first point is that the aim of kings was never to spread their religion. The only king who spread his religion in the world was Emperor Ashok, who spread Buddhism by sending many of preachers to talk about the humanistic aspects of Buddhism. So that can be probably the only example where some king is spreading his religion. Now, of course, in Northeast India, there have been invasion of many Muslim kings, but that was not the mechanism which brought Islam into India. Islam first enters India through the Arab traders coming to Malabar coast, and the testimony to that comes from the first mosque in India which came up in Kerala. Let me remind you that in Kerala there was no rule of Muslim king till the 15th century when Tipu Sultan extended his empire into Kerala. So these Arab traders were coming, and it was the interaction from the Arab traders that Islam started spreading in India. What was the second reason, and which many of our great saints like Swami Vivekananda point out? They point out that the major cause of spread of Islam was the aspiration of untouchables, the aspirations of those low on the caste hierarchy to escape the caste Varna atrocities in the search of equality. That's what led them to conversion to Islam. And the major impact on this was because of the Sufi saints. Major impact of Sufi saints was there all over, and Sufi saints who were very much rooted in the local plural traditions, Sufi saints who were emphasizing on the humanistic aspects of religion. Like Bhakti saints, Sufi saints also emphasized on the humanistic aspects of religion, and this attracted large people who saw that they are being treated with dignity and respect and equality by these Sufi saints, and that's what made them to embrace Islam in large number. One knows that Islam, rather no religion, can spread by sword. In Islam itself there is a saying, to me my religion, to you your religion. And in different parts of the world like Sumatra, Java, Burma, parts of China, again it was traders or through other means, the means of saints, that Islam spread in those parts of the country also. Now today if we see in India, the distribution of Muslim population is maximally there in the areas which are far away from rule, rather the capital of Muslim kings. Capital of most of the Muslim kings was in Delhi, but if you see, the high percentage of Muslims is there in Kerala, Bengal, Assam, and those regions which are far off from the power center of rule of the Muslim kings. So these particular things tell us that Islam, which tries to give the message of equality, did attract many of the people from those victims, people who were victims of the caste Varna atrocities, because of which they were kept low on the hierarchy, because of which they were not permitted to enter into the temples. One of the great examples of this conversion, of course it is at individual level, but this does give us some hint, and there is a conversion to Islam of a great musician, A.R. Rahman. I like to remind my friends here that A.R. Rahman, in the beginning he was a Hindu. His name was Dilip Kumar. Dilip Kumar faced some problem, emotional problem. He got disturbed because his father had developed cancer. Now, in order to overcome his grief and sadness and tension, he started meeting certain people and he came across a Sufi saint. Under the influence of the teachings of Sufi saint, he embraced Islam and he became a Muslim. That's basically what tells us that some of the individual cases also got like that. Now, in history, some of the cases are regularly cited that Aurangzeb killed this person, Aurangzeb told that king that you accept my religion, otherwise I'll kill you. Of course, that is true. It is true that the rivals of certain kings who did not belong to that religion, when they were defeated by a particular king, the victor king tried to humiliate the defeated king by trying to put insulting conditions on that person. And that's what we see in this case also, that Aurangzeb and Sambhaji, there is a very famous case. Sambhaji was killed very brutally because he was defeated or he had to face a setback, and Aurangzeb, as a sort of a revenge, asked that you accept my religion, you accept Islam, which he refused to do. So these are individual cases. This is now not how the mass conversion to Islam takes place. Let's be very clear. There is a phenomenon where there is an individual rivalry, and the victor in the rivalry game tries to humiliate the defeated king, while the mass conversions are always because of certain social phenomenon, and in case of spread of Islam, it is the longing for equality and longing for escape from unequal society. It is also accused that many Muslim kings impose jizya, tax on those people who are not Muslims. Now, they accuse that this jizya tax was imposed so that people turn to Islam to escape the jizya. Let me say right at the beginning that jizya tax was much less than the regular zakat which the Muslims have to pay for the sake of social welfare. Now, what was jizya? Number one, jizya was not put forward, jizya was not imposed by all the Muslim kings. Some Muslim kings like Aurangzeb, they did put jizya tax, and that too not in the beginning of their rule. That they imposed 21 years after their rule. Somewhere Aurangzeb put it in 1689. Of course, he was that time expanding his empire towards the south. He was hard of cash in the treasury, and this is one of the taxes he thought of imposing. As such, theoretically, jizya tax is supposed to be a tax levied by Muslim king on the non-Muslim subjects. Non-Muslim subjects in a Muslim, under the rule of a Muslim king, they are called dhimmi. What is a dhimmi? Dhimmi is a person who is protected by the state. In lieu of that, this particular charge is done. So, of course, it is not a good tax. Any religion-based thing is not welcome, and definitely all the Muslim kings did not do it. Many Muslim kings waved it off, and even Aurangzeb put this much later during his kingdom. Now, apart from jizya, the other thing which is generally imputed on the Muslim kings relates to their humiliation of Hindu women, their appropriation of Hindu women for the sake of their luxury. Now, it is very true that Muslim kings, or for that matter I must say most of the kings, had big harems, the place where queens used to live, and the armies of the kings, when they were out on their plunder project, they used to not only pick up the wealth, they also were picking up women and abducting them. So it's a gender issue. Armies versus women, armies who are reckless in their expansion, and those sort of things they tried to do. In the similar light, I will try to say that recently some of the films have been coming which have been trying to portray kings, Muslim kings, in a very negative light. The films which were earlier very welcome, like Mughal-e-Azam, where a Muslim king is marrying a Hindu woman. Though that is a fictional account, it may not be accurate and all that, but there was no problem with the people. People were seeing the beautiful culture, the beautiful diversity which Akbar's court was displaying. Akbar's court having a Lord Krishna temple within his court, within his castle, because he had a Hindu wife. Now, same film which was that Mughal-e-Azam was the earlier film, probably in the decade of 1960s. Lately, when it came in the form of Jodha Akbar, another film, that time there was a lot of opposition to it, saying that Muslim king marrying a Hindu woman is a matter of dishonor for Hindus, it's a matter of dishonor for Rajputs. Of course, similarly, when lately film like Padmavat came, Padmavati, of course it was initially titled Padmavati, then it was changed to Padmavat, because some people objected to the thing, Karni Sena and all that, they went on to object to it. Now, if we go deeper into this Alauddin Khilji film, one sees that how the biases, the prejudices which have been cultivated against Muslim kings, how they get reflected on this period films through the narrations which are currently popular. And in this film, Padmavat, Alauddin is shown to be a barbaric person running after women and running after food, eating the food like a barbarian. The real story is that Padmavat was actually a novel. It was a piece of fiction written by Malik Muhammad Jaisi, and it has a deeper philosophical meaning related to world, one's aspirations and all that. Now, the people who were living at the time of Alauddin Khilji, during that period, the books which came out do not mention any Padmavati. They do not mention the attack of Chittor by Khilji for acquiring Padmavati. Padmavati is a piece of fiction, and because it came as a novel, that novel became popular, and the bards, local bards, started singing it in different villages. It became very popular as a folklore. Now, in 1800s, one British historian, he tried to recollect the oral history, and he took it to be a part of history and brought it in the Gazette. He brought it into the annals of the history books, from where again it was presented as a history. But the real thing is not like that. Most of the armies belonging to most of the kings were doing similar sort of a thing, but now currently in India, many period films are trying to demonize the Muslim kings, while Alauddin Khilji was one of the person who was believing in the court mannerisms from Persia. He has been the builder of Hauj Khas in Delhi. He regulated the market in a more systematic way. So these are his contributions, right or wrong, that is another matter. But the way he was presented in the film, shows how the doctored communal historiography is affecting the presentation of fiction, presentation of films in the modern times, which is further deepening and worsening the issues. Thank you very much.